I'll be pleased to be your moderator this afternoon. And we're going to, this afternoon, focus on this roundtable, number 1, on climate adaptation for the most vulnerable people. And this is complementing the other 3 roundtables, which are all looking at one different aspect of cities and climate adaptation and citizen resilience, which is the focal theme for World Cities Day 2021. But without further ado, before I introduce the session, I would like to request Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, the Minister of the Ministry of International Cooperation of Egypt, to provide some opening remarks for this session. Minister, you have the floor.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Luxor. Before being Minister of International Cooperation, I was Minister of Tourism, so it's heartwarming to see everybody here physically after a long time. Well, at the outset, I would like to thank the United Nations and the Ministry of Local Development for choosing Luxor to be a platform for exchanging ideas and experiences on sustainable urban development, how we enhance opportunities to adapt to rapid climate changes, and how to raise standards of living of people around the world, especially those who are most vulnerable. I think that's what we are going to be discussing during the session. There's a huge opportunity for international cooperation and for exchange of ideas and modalities across different countries, across different cities, to mitigate the negative impacts that we see from climate change. Our region faces many risks that are directly related to the lives of citizens on a daily basis, and the most affected groups, mainly agricultural workers, fishermen, women in certain and men in desert areas. This is what was identified under the UN partnerships framework for the 14th category. To face and confront climate change, in the case of Egypt, there have been several projects related to not just SDG 11 in sustainable cities, but when we take a look at our partnerships with multilateral and bilateral development partners, there has been plenty happening with respect to water waste management projects, to an integrated framework for energy, which has renewables with certain targets by 2035, by 2042, and the total official development assistance that we have with our development partners, 25% goes to the SDG on renewable energy, another 23% on clean water. And SDG number 11, which is the topic we are discussing here, represents maybe 5% of our full portfolio with the different development partners. Of course, all of you have heard about one key project that Egypt is pushing through, which is Haya Karima. Haya Karima is basically to help the vulnerable people in the different rural communities mitigate or try to push forward on development. It is one of the projects that addresses the 17 SDGs. It looks at strengthening infrastructure services, human development. There are social interventions as well as economic development. And in this framework, through Haya Karima, we are also trying to showcase how we can take a very big vision, and as was mentioned this morning, try and operationalize it and implement it at a very local level with interventions that have impact. We are working with different stakeholders, be it multilateral, bilateral institutions, be it the NGOs that are on the ground, the private sector playing a big role in all of this. So this is a very good example of how we can mitigate the impact or actually help the vulnerable groups. The other maybe important element that is quite important going forward is as we are going through the green recovery today, post the pandemic, climate change is also very much high on the agenda. Today, COP26 is starting. As Egypt is in a year going to be hosting COP27, there's plenty that we can also showcase to show how the different skills of people can become more green And this also basically also contributes to staving off the impact on the vulnerable groups. I just want to mention some of the projects with UN agencies that have had an impact on vulnerable groups. We have with IFAD promoting resilience in desert environment. A project is called Pride. And this has been very important in reducing poverty, enhancing food and nutrition security. So this is one example of cooperation that also addresses the topic of the session. We also have UNDP's enhancing climate change adaptation in the northern coast and the Nile Delta, another very important project that also basically is based on the IPCC assessment report and also helps the vulnerable in very important spots that are affected by climate. So I think that we have 12 months where we can move forward on try to showcase the different adaptation mitigation projects that the country has done. Also within these 12 months, there will be a lot of progress with respect to Haya Karima, where also vulnerable groups are going to be protected from different climate change and otherwise. So there will be plenty for us to showcase and share experiences with the world next November in Sharm el-Sheikh, inshallah. Thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for those kind words, and we're all looking forward to seeing enhanced action and towards Sharm el-Sheikh Summit COP27 a year from now. So let's start this session. The theme of this World Cities Day, as you know, is Adapting Cities for Climate Resilience. And the Secretary General, in his message to World Cities Day, says that there are more than 1 billion people living in informal settlements in very vulnerable, many of them in very vulnerable situations in the face of climate change. And what we also have heard this morning is that less than 5% of the climate finance is going to adaptation. And of that, also less than 10% is going to cities and city level action. So there's a huge gap between the need and what is currently on offer. So we're going to ask the different panelists about their opinion, their perspectives on these topics. So we have identified 3 different main questions for this roundtable, which I would like to lay out for you. And then I'll introduce the different panelists who are here in person and the panelists who are also online today. But let me first highlight these key questions which we would like to address. So we would like to look in which ways cities can finance, plan, build, and manage urban adaptation and climate resilience, especially in the urban hotspots of vulnerability. And we will look at that with representatives from local, subnational, national governments, civil society, and research institutes who are with you today as panelists in this roundtable. So the first question is, how can we amplify the voices to hear the needs of vulnerable groups as stakeholders in this resilience building planning process? Because they bring in valuable data, energy, and can test the feasibility of resilient solutions. The second question that we would like to propose is, how can we vertically align the action at the county, at the city level, with the action at the national level? And so that these urban climate action plans coming from the bottom are connecting to national climate action, like the NDCs that are being discussed in Glasgow starting today. And then how are the city policies reacting to those national policies? And finally, the question of finance. How can we accelerate climate adaptation finance to secure a breakthrough in adaptation and resilience, particularly in these hotspots of vulnerability? And for the last question, we would like to connect this with COVID-19 recovery, because there are opportunities in the recovery to connect both with climate mitigation and adaptation. So this is the scope of this session, and I'll hope you'll look carefully at what the speakers are going to present in terms of their perspectives, and I'm going to present the speakers now one by one and then engage in the debate. And let's start here from my left. We first have Honorable Professor Peter Anyang. He's the governor of Kisumu County in Kenya on Lake Victoria. He's a Kenyan politician, and he has been a member of parliament for 20 years. He has been a senator in Kenya under the new constitution, has been a cabinet minister of planning and national development and also of medical services. And as a governor in Kisumu, he has launched a new urban spatial planning strategy to transform Kisumu city and lift some priorities for action in Kisumu towards sustainable urban development. The next speaker, next to Professor Nyong'o, is Minister Marta Delgado from Mexico. You have heard Honorable Minister this morning already in the high-level segment of this World Cities Day. Marta Delgado is the president of UN Habitat Assembly, but she is an environmentalist, and she is currently Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She was elected to local Congress in 2003, and she also served as a Minister of the Environment of Mexico City. And when she was Minister of the Environment in Mexico City, she helped to develop environmental policies, including a green plan of Mexico City, the climate action program, and a bike sharing program called EcoBiki. So this is a short resume of Marta Delgado sitting here live on the panel, and Marta will also provide the closing remarks for this roundtable. Then moving further, we have Dr. Monica Koffer. She's from the ITC of the University of Twente, and she's a researcher whose main interests are urban remote sensing, SDG monitoring, mapping deprived areas like informal settlements and slums, and analyzing urban form and dynamics with remote sensing and spatial statistical metrics. And she is also co-chairing a network on deprivation area mapping, and she's also leading as a project director several of ITC's projects related to remote sensing applications. And then the final panel on understanding the nature of urban risks and the way in which daily hazards, major disasters, and climate change can affect low-income urban residents. So he's working with local organizations, international agencies, and universities to build resilience in urban communities and cities. And then we also have two speakers who you see on your screen, which I would like to introduce briefly. First, Ms. Sheela Patel. She's the founder of SDI, Slum Dwellers International, and the founding director of SPARC. SPARC is the Society for Promotion of Area Resource Centers, which is an NGO that has been working since 1984 to support community organizations of the urban poor in their efforts to access secure housing and basic amenities and seek their rights to the city. She is widely recognized nationally and internationally for seeking attention to the issues of urban poverty, housing, and infrastructure onto the radar of governments, bilateral and international agencies. Welcome, Sheela, to this panel virtually. And finally, our final speaker is Mr. Alessandro Reinoldi from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. He is the head of Territorial Development Unit of the JRC, and he has a degree in economics from the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, and has previously worked in journalism and research. He teaches European Union regional funds at the European College of Parma, and he has interests in governance, innovation, financial engineering, and evaluation. So welcome very much, Mr. Alessandro, to this panel. So you have now the 6 panelists. So what I'll do now is start right away with the first question and address the question to 1 or 2 or 3 participants who may have a prime perspective on this, and then also allow others to also chip in with their ideas, and then try to get the conversation on this topic going. So we'll start with the first question, which is the question related to the vulnerability and amplifying the voices of the urban poor. And I would like to ask the same question to both Dr. David Dodman and Dr. Monica Koffer. And my question is, how can we best amplify the voice and hear the needs of urban vulnerable groups as stakeholders of the participatory resilience building processes, so that they contribute effectively related to providing and sharing data, and also to contribute to feasible, resilient solutions? It's a long question, but I'll give the floor to first David. You have the floor, David.
Great. Thanks very much, Raf, and thanks to everyone who's enabled this very important conference and session to be taking place. I'd like to start by identifying where I think the key areas are that we need to be acting to build resilience for the urban poor, and then come to some practical ways in which the low-income groups in cities themselves can actually take part and be driving the processes that build their resilience. So one of the things which I realized I left out and would have been perhaps slightly more interesting in the introduction is that I've been spending a lot of my time in the last couple of years working on the latest assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And the work that we've done there has highlighted that there are 3 main domains that we need to be working on to build resilience in cities, and particularly for the people who have been most marginalized and most vulnerable. And each of these is absolutely essential, and none of them is sufficient on its own. So firstly, we need to think about the social drivers of risk and vulnerability and the social drivers of resilience. And these are really important for vulnerable groups, because these are the things which help to make people on low incomes be vulnerable. If they don't have access to the rule of law, the protection from the rule of law, if they don't have access to social insurance and social protection schemes, if they don't have access to public health infrastructure and systems, it's going to deepen and deepen vulnerability. So these social elements are absolutely critical. Then, of course, there are the physical elements, the actual built infrastructure that makes up the city. The drains, the roadways, the pavements, the coastal protection, the river bankments, all of these things perhaps have been most understood as being critical for reducing risk, but still remain an important part of the equation. And thirdly, and it was mentioned this morning, the importance of nature-based solutions. The amount of practice and evidence that we have showing how trees, reforestation, urban parks, coastal and wetland restoration can be absolutely critical in reducing climate-related risk, and can also meet many of the other needs for livelihoods of low-income groups. So what would we do then if we treated social responses, physical responses, and nature-based responses to build resilience in a way that meaningfully incorporated the voice and priorities of low-income groups in the city? So I'm going to give examples, I think, for each of these and the way that it has been done and the way that we can think of doing it more. So firstly, one of the big issues around providing social infrastructure to reduce risk is a lack of information about who is entitled to benefits and who is in need of those benefits. And we have fantastic examples of the way in which organized community groups and federations of the urban poor have been able to collect the sort of data that shows who is most at need and who ought to be entitled to support in this area. And we can talk later, and Sheela may mention the Know Your City campaign, which is perhaps the best example of data that is being driven by low-income groups themselves. What about nature-based solutions? I'm going to do something very unusual on my part and give a British example, because although I am British, almost all of my work is outside of the UK. And in preparing for the COP next week, I've been talking to people from the city of Manchester, one of the largest cities in England. And they've been very excited about a community park in one of the most deprived areas of this large northern English cities, a community park called West Gorton Community Park. And they're excited about this because this is a part of the city that has historically lacked amenities, and has also historically been badly affected by flooding. And so the response in this particular area, low-income area within a British city, has been to develop a sponge park to absorb floodwater, but also to provide amenity value to groups that need it more than most others in the city. And finally, the built infrastructure. Of course, we understand that at the scale of the city, there needs to be large-scale trunk infrastructure, particularly in large cities. But we also have so many examples of where grassroots and community organizations have both planned and built and maintained infrastructure that reduces risk. Things like examples from seawalls in the Philippines, where the Philippines Homeless People's Federation has worked with local governments to build and maintain seawalls. Things like micro drainage networks in low-income city and low-income neighborhoods in Gorakhpur, a city in Uttar Pradesh in India. So we have examples of how the decisions and the implementation of social, nature-based and physical infrastructure really can draw on the insights and the priorities of the people who are most affected by the risks that these things can reduce.
Thank you very much, David, for this very clear analysis with examples from North and South, focusing on social, physical infrastructure and nature-based solutions. I'll now turn to Monica Koffer for her perspective on the same question, and then after I'll ask Sheela to do the same. Monica, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot. I would like to follow up what we heard just now, the lack of information. Myself being a geospatial data scientist, so of course I will focus on the question, how much evidences do we have on the situation of the urban poor and the interaction with climate? So when we look into cities, and that's, I think we heard today quite prominently that looking, for example, to African cities, that the majority of the urban population belong to the urban poor, but their needs are not taken care. We have very insufficient knowledge. We have insufficient finance to help them to prepare for climate change. When you look also to global existing data sets, like global population models we are working with, you see that the areas of the deprived communities, urban poor, they're systematically underestimated, underrepresented. Sometimes it's maybe 10% of the real population living in such areas, which are existing in such global population data sets. We also have insufficient knowledge about the hazard conditions of these areas. We know and we suspect, and we have been also proving and showing that the urban poor are systematically more susceptible to hazards. They are always located at the most hazard-prone location, be it flood, be it landslide, being affected by environmental conditions like the massive amount of waste which is flowing through communities after flood events. But we don't have global data sets to prove and to stress the strong evidences to show that we need to take action, that we need to voice the issues of communities. Also, when you look on the situation of if you want to survey vulnerabilities, socioeconomic health vulnerabilities in communities, and you typically take like health sample surveys, then not having data, spatial data on the location of urban poor simply underrepresents them in samples. For example, taking the city of Nairobi, where 60% of the urban population is living in about 4% of the build-up area. If you take a sample for a sample survey, for a household survey over the city, a random sample, you will not cover much of the urban poor. So it's basically the voices are not heard. Also taking the example, which we might come back later to, like a new trend, which is forecast-based financing or predictive aid, so where you want to make funds available before a disaster occurs. If you take such data which are systematically not covering or omitting, underrepresenting the urban poor, you will have massive issues that they are not taken care of. Not taking care of also in the understanding of their diversity, because we don't look into the specific vulnerabilities of women, of the youth, which have, knowing that in these communities you have a massive concentration of young people and their future, which is not really voiced. What we see, we are working with local community groups in generating data in communities, also supporting local governments in generating data. What we see is a massive lack. So there's a lot of capacity and willingness in generate data. There's a lack of analyzing data in local communities and working with the knowledge of data, with evidence in negotiation with local governments, in building actions together. So what I want to conclude with on that question is that we have presently like a really a shortage of understanding what is the scale of the problem of the urban poor, the future threats they will be faced due to climate change. And we need to support them and building together with local actors evidences, which is the first step to climate actions and adaptation measurements. Thanks.
Thank you, Monica, for stressing the need for knowledge, data on the livelihoods, on the location, on the needs of people living in overcrowded conditions, in vulnerable conditions. Let me see what Sheela has to add to this same question. Sheela, you have heard from David and Monica. Do you agree? What is your perspective on this issue? How can we amplify the voice of the urban poor so that their needs are better heard?
Apologies, my mic was muted. I want to thank you all who are organizing today's event to invite me.
Sheela, looks like you're muted. Is that possible?
My mic is on now. Can you hear me now? Hello? I can't hear. I'm on here.
Try again, Sheela.
Hello, Raf, can you hear me?
Perfect, perfect.
Great. So let me start again. As all of you who are organizing this event, and especially for the hosts, our local hosts in Egypt, I want to first of all congratulate you for bringing the next COP into the Global South. And apart from being a grassroots activist working on issues of the urban poor, I was invited last year to be an ambassador for the Race to Resilience. So I look forward to working with the next champion that will come from Egypt. So having said that, let me respond to both what you said, Raf, and what both Monica and David, who are good friends of mine, have to say. You know, I belong to a social movement. And I think that the first thing I want to say is that unless these billions of people who are vulnerable, both urban and rural, are not organized to produce collective voice, the transformation that we require them to participate in will not happen. Yet development assistance always treats poor people as individuals who you force feed into solutions that all of us as professionals think are good for them. And I think that's the first reflection we need to have. Poor people in cities, especially the cities in the global south with which I am familiar, have been intergenerationally poor for 3 to 5 generations. As a result of that, they have an amazing potential for survival, and their resilience is at the survival stage. So they do not proceed to transform their lives into any form of mobility or improvement because there are deep structural impediments. So taken by themselves, good quality data, good practice, good partnerships, good, all the good things that you talk about are being said for the last 4 decades that I have been working. I have seen very few countries and very few cities and very few global programs actually demonstrate that they don't do it at a project level, but have institutionalized this at city level. And so 9 out of 10 times, the mayors and the municipality that are the closest face of the state for poor people are locked in an adversarial relationship because of structural problems that make informality continuously invisible. So what Monica says, that volumes, depth of what is needed is not done. And I can tell you that there are research after research after research that say the same thing. Small amount of land, largest volume of people, no infrastructure, no amenities and services, no health infrastructure, increasing informality of work, large mitigation projects that do not in any way serve the urban poor. So if this is the status, regardless of the fact that we have seminars like this, my major plea to everybody is no more talk. Next year, when we meet in COP, we should all talk about the sustained commitment and 5-year plans that we take to move out of this present difficult situation, which is getting worse, for which everybody from global to local have to change, including the urban poor themselves. And so in order to do that, let me tell you what social movements of the urban poor are doing. Unfortunately, we have neither the resources nor the capacities to take every single slum in every single city and transform them into organized networks. But we have models, both urban and rural, of social movements that show how powerful collective action of voice, choice, and representation these institutional arrangements can do with the poor. And wherever they have seen a sympathetic, excited, enthusiastic mayor and local government, it has transformed these roles and relationships and produced a pathway for change. There are three things that I think are very critical in cities to change. First of all, we have the most dysfunctional development planning rules and regulations that do nothing about the reality that everybody living in informal settlements is illegal, is a squatter, and therefore not entitled to anything. The second thing is there is no, despite all the excitement of, all the digitalization and the amazing growth of artificial intelligence and everything, our ability to put these instruments equally in the hands of the poor as scientists and big shot researchers is not happening. So poor people become beneficiaries and targets of other people's data collection. And at best, we are patronizingly invited to participate in projects where we will collect our own data, but it's not our data in terms of our own analysis and our representation and what we want to do with the data. So the fact that there are not enough toilets, there is not enough water, the food situation in cities, which devastatingly showed what was happening during COVID times, is very apparent. And so I feel that at the heart of all these problems, especially when everybody finally brings in the private sector, we hope governments are not abdicating their own roles as duty bearers. But the reality is that we are stuck in a 200-year project of modernization. All our countries want to imitate northern cities, which work for the elite in our cities, but are completely inaccessible, unavailable, and exclusionary to those who live informally, who, by the way, are going to double in the next 10 years, regardless of whether we fulfill our SDG and climate targets, because of the manner in which we have developed our global economy. And finally, what I want to say is that there was a clarion call made before this, called Adapt or Die, by one of my fellow ambassadors, Emma. And what that basically says is that seriously good quality adaptation that produces good quality resilience is the need of the day, and it is local. You have to produce local transformation, changing local demands, demanding different things of our governments. That will produce both the fulfillment of the SDGs as well as that of the climate targets that we have. And we therefore say that the change of architecture, which both David and Monica talked about, and which I hope this conference will look at, has to change the architecture. We have changed it temporarily in some places in relationship to COVID, but it's temporary. We believe that it will roll off as soon as some form of normality comes in. So thank you so much for inviting me. I hope my presentation helps the discourse, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheela, for this reality check, indicating that there have been 4 decades of clearly expressing the needs of people in informal settlements, yet the investments are not matching those needs. So I think this is quite stark, as well as your call for structural change, a change of architecture. Before I move to our other panelists, I just want to ask either David or Monica if they want to react to what Sheela has said, or whether they see any way forward, you know, in the short run, how to match those needs with the type of proposals that are coming out.
Just a very quick reply. And I've heard this voicing what Sheela said, to have the urban poor as the target of data collection, of being part of artificial intelligence-based models. And that's something which I see very rapidly. And it's like, on one hand, there's this problem that these models are biased against the urban poor often, because data are not well covered. They're not well covered in the models, and actually this makes the situation even worse as an outcome for the urban poor, because they're totally under modeled. And then this huge question that researchers, and myself being a researcher, a lot of research is done but never communicated back and not done with communities. And we really have to change this mindset. That's, I think, a very strong point, at least from a researcher perspective.
Very good. Okay, thanks. So let's leave this for a while. I mean, this is an important topic. This is the basis of our discussion, looking indeed at the resilience and adaptation for the most vulnerable people. But now I would like to bring in our two policy makers in this room, and starting from the local and subnational level to the national level. So I would like to ask Professor Peter Nyong'o, how can the climate action be integrated in national and city policy while still responding to the needs of the most vulnerable people? Honorable Governor.
Thank you very much. I think first, to begin with, we must understand that although we have subnational governments, whether in Kenya or Egypt or Mexico, they operate within a national framework. So in Kenya, we say we have 48 governments in one, 47 county and one national, so that they are interdependent, although separate. In the area of environment and urban resilience, we have two institutions at the national level. One, the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. Secondly, the National Environment Management Agency. The national government's role really is to make policy and provide resources for environmental needs. The county governments implement some of these policies and regulations at the local level. In our case, for example, in Kisumu, Kisumu is a city of about 800,000 people during the day and 500,000 during the night, which means that it's a trading city. During the day, you have 300,000 more people in the city than at night. So there's a lot of movement between Kisumu and the western part of Kenya and the rest of Kenya. Secondly, Kisumu, like most cities and towns in Kenya, has a dichotomy in terms of residents. On the one side, you have people who live in the informal sector who happen to be the majority. On the other side, you have people who live in formal sectors, much more established, better planned, and so on, with more facilities. So this is really an anomaly, because the majority of the people are not really enjoying the goods in life, but the normal goods, good life and so on, whereas the minority does. Now, this is a colonial inheritance, whereby the Africans were expected to live in low-cost housing, quite often in slums, while providing cheap labor to the colonial economy. We have not managed to change this radically since then. So the whole idea of making the urban area resilient is to be inclusive in trying to get rid of so-called informality and convert it to formality. Why do I say so? When I was a teacher at the university for quite some time, I used to tell my students that there's one saying that Karl Marx made, which is still relevant up to this very day. And he said the following in one of his treatises, that philosophers have described the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. I think that's the point that Patel was making just as she was speaking, that there's no need to having homilies and stories and data about the informal sector, about the poor in urban areas and so on, when you know that they're suffering. Our responsibility is to transform that informality into formality and bring those so-called people in informal settlement or slums into the kind of life that you and I live. This is going to cost money. This is going to require planning. In our case, for example, we have been working with UN Habitat. First, to have a geophysical and spatial plan for Kisumu City, which tells us who lives where, what they do, where the rivers, where the roads, and so on. Why is it that the informal sectors get flooded when it rains, where the formal and don't? What is happening? Is there drainage in the formal sector? Is there sewage and so on? The kind of services needed in the informal sector to formalize them is where the issue is. So let us plan first, a geophysical and spatial plan, which zones the cities, tell us who lives where, then makes us make a decision that if we are not going to leave anybody behind, how do we use this plan for inclusivity? What kind of resources do we have to abolish informality, to abolish the informal sector, to abolish slums so that they are not an object for descriptions and data gathering and homilies year in, year out in conferences, so that they become part and parcel of urban life. That is when the urban areas will be resilient to face the vagaries of the weather. One last example. Recently, last year in particular, Kisumu received one of the worst flooding that has been known over the last 60 years. The last time we had such a flooding was in 1963, but we didn't do anything about it. This time it was worse. Businesses along the lake were destroyed, particularly informal settlements and slums were flooded, and it cost us a lot of money just to do remedial action. What was the lesson we were learning? We were learning that for quite some time, we have abused the environment. The rivers have been silted. Lake Victoria has been rotting from the bottom. And when there was global warming, the water levels rose to an unusual high and almost swallowed the city. So in our plan, we must take care of this phenomenon, not just for the informal settlements, but for the city as a whole. So in our plan that we are now thinking about is complete revision of what the urban plan should be for sustainable development and resilient living. So I think this is a lesson to most places, not just in Kisumu, but this is what I would say today, that what we are going to do now is the two programs we have, for example, Kenya Informal Sector Program, KISIP, financed by the World Bank, and also Kenya Urban Settlement Program, also done, financed by the World Bank, that we should use these funds very carefully, not just what we are doing now in terms of building infrastructure, non-motorized transport and so on, but investing in informal settlement and the slums to formalize them, bring them into the main matrix of urban planning and urban settlement, and not treat them as something aside that are kept for some future intervention and not intervention today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, Governor. Stressing the spatial inequality in many cities, the need to transform and to embrace or to bring in informal settlements into the formal framework, and the need to invest in informal settlements with some very concrete and recent examples. I'd like now to turn to Honorable Marta Delgado, who, as I mentioned earlier, has served as an environmental secretary in Mexico City and is now at the federal level. How can climate action in your country and beyond take into account the needs of the urban poor?
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I could greet Mr. Rafael Tuts from UN Habitat for moderating this panel. And I would like to share some thoughts regarding how a vulnerable city or community can be adapted to climate change. The first thing that I want to share is that it is very difficult to adapt a country. We have to adapt communities or cities. It is very challenging for the country to think how to adapt the whole territory, and the impacts of climate change are imposed in specific territories. So when we are to really develop a strategy for adaptation and also to gain resilience of that community to any impact of climate change or either other impact for the communities, we need to think for the characteristics or the systems that are involved involving that specific community. In some cases, as in climate change, the vulnerable sectors of society and of the community are more vulnerable, are more marginalized populations, are more vulnerable to those impacts. And the capacity to adapt to those impacts is very correlated to the social and economic development of that society. So the first challenge for really getting adaptation for vulnerable communities is to allocate some financial resources to prevent and to plan what is going to happen when the impacts will come. So the capacity also to adapt a community is related to the consciousness and the preventive ability of the authorities, but also the population. The cultural changes that we need to react to any phenomenon is important. In Mexico City, for example, we are not, we have a city that it is vulnerable because of earthquakes, because of flooding, because of the weather. So for the earthquakes, we have developed a very early awareness monitoring, and we have alarms that sounds, and the people know what to do if an earthquake is coming in the next minute, for example. So that warnings for in the purist communities and in vulnerable communities are also very important, and the cultural change that we need to organize around these events. I want also to think how to cross the challenge on financing. The vulnerable communities also are vulnerable because they do not have enough resources, financial resources, to face their problems. Their infrastructure is lack of some quality, and we need to find the way of, for example, using some insurance ways to solve the problem of getting a fund, enough funds to organize the plans for vulnerable cities resilience. Developing world, those measures that can provide trade-offs for vulnerable communities are also very interesting. For example, we have to prioritize the vulnerabilities of a community. And there are, for example, some policies for reducing risks. For example, better draining systems that also provides health procurement and also climate prevention of that vulnerability for floods. So those investments that are both from education, from health, but also for climate and for environment are better for all these kind of communities. Finally, I want to mention that the evolution of technology is very fast around the world, and the prevention is very related with the technology and the ability of cities and city mayors and authorities to decide in a better sense. So, for example, sensors for monitoring air quality, or the revolution of food production inside the cities, or the traffic controls that are intelligent and avoid also the air pollution. all those systems are related to technology, and it's frequent that vulnerable communities doesn't have access to that technology. One very good manner of helping those communities is for the federal governments to provide enough intelligence for them to really deliver this information and to organize all the policies around the technology revolution that we are facing. I want to say a final comment. COVID provided us a more resilience in a year that climate change in 30 years. Why? Why? We were able to invest, to change our behavior, to change our way of living, to change our mobility, our relationships in 1 year. And in 30 years for climate change, we are not really able to do that because it's not impacting really direct and fast. So we have known about climate change from 30 years ago to now, and we really have to understand that the impacts of climate change in cities and vulnerable communities are going to be worse than the COVID.
Thank you so much, and really very powerful concluding remark and observation about the impact of adaptation and a parallel with COVID-19, where we have been able to react, whereas in terms of adaptation, reaction is very slow, and financing is also very slow. But also in the beginning, when you said that you cannot adapt a country, you have to adapt a community or a city. These are, I think, very wise words, speaking directly to the theme of this session, and then also mentioning technology as something that should be put at the disposal of the needs of vulnerable communities. So now we're going to move to, it's almost 4 o'clock. We have until 4:30 for this session. We're going to move to the third question, which is about financing. And there we have one of our speakers online, and then we also have a short video message from one of the speakers who had to leave early this afternoon. But we'll start with the question, to pose a question to Mr. Alessandro Rinaldi. How can we achieve a breakthrough for climate adaptation finance that responds to a green, just and resilient COVID-19 recovery, also targeting the most vulnerable first? Mr. Rinaldi, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Rafael, and thanks a lot to UN Habitat and the organizers of this great event. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and share my thoughts with you all. Rafael, you have put probably the million-dollar question. It is indeed very I would say interesting and powerful to talk about this, how to bring together effectiveness and inclusiveness of policy action. It's a different story when you try to act and you try to achieve the objectives you have in your head. Let me try to share some thoughts on a couple of points. The first one is about localization. We all know that climate change effects and impacts are not neutral across territories. We also know that solutions are not universal, meaning that there is no actual and clear solution that fits everybody everywhere. So the localization of the efforts is absolutely crucial. But it's not enough. I think that we have to go further and put together a genuine and concrete synchronicity between policy efforts at all territorial levels, starting from cities, from local authorities, subnational authorities, national governments, and international organizations. Well, the European Union has put forward very recently First, a huge effort on recovery and resilience with the newly established Recovery and Resilience Fund and plans, which is mostly addressed at the member states, so at the national governments. In parallel, the EU has set up 5 research and innovation missions that set I would say grand targets, grand objectives for the next decade. But in both cases, we have realized that national effort in that case with international funding is not enough. We have to go down to the granular territorial level. And on the other side, we cannot leave local authorities alone in fighting climate adaptation just because, I mean, the battleground is really there. It's really where people live and work. This is my first point. So we need policy alignment across territorial levels, and we need policy alignment across domains as well. We cannot bring forward policy effort in a specific sector which is completely detached from other policy efforts in other sectors, but that impact the same places and the same and the people who live in those places. So and in order to go one step beyond, I think that we need to move from listening to people, listening to the communities, to enabling them and empowering them. In the European Union, we have experimented a methodology to develop innovation strategies, territorial innovation strategies based on the combination of evidence coming from the scientific knowledge, so science-based knowledge, with community-based knowledge. And the combination of the two may give more power to the priority for public policy investment chosen together between government, main stakeholders, but also communities. This methodology is called, in the European jargon, smart specialization, and we have been working on this in the world of EU regional and cohesion funding, and are now working with a UN interagency task team in applying smart specialization in order to underpin STI, so science, technology, innovation roadmaps for the SDGs that would work at the local level. Finally, how to what is about for the most vulnerable? Well, I think here I actually would like to sympathize with my predecessor speaker from Kenya. I think that we indeed we should not treat the most vulnerable as a completely separate category, but trying to mainstream the issue of vulnerability and the issue of equality into the main channels of policy effort. And this is something that it's not easy, but in the European Union policymaking circle, not only for internal policy but also for external policy, so for the construction of international partnerships, we are striving to achieve. And I will stop here from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Rinaldi, for emphasizing the need for policy alignment across different territorial levels, also the link between science-based and community-based knowledge, and finally emphasizing the issue of mainstreaming vulnerability as part of main policy rather than looking at the groups, for instance, in informal settlements separately. I would like now to ask the Secretariat to briefly screen the video message from one of our participants who was supposed to be here with us today on the stage, but had to leave early, Mr. Andrew Chimphondah from Shelter Afrique, who has also a message on this topic of this roundtable. Please.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Rafael, Tuts, for giving us an opportunity to talk today at this very auspicious roundtable with the star-studded panelists that we have. I would love to stand on existing protocols and just appreciate, of course, our host, His Excellency, the Minister of Local Government, Major General Mahmoud Sharawi, and of course, the Executive Director of the UN for inviting us, Madam Maimouna Sharif. And it would be remiss for me not to recognize my brother and the Honorable Governor for Kisumu County in Kenya, who's also here with us today, Professor Peter Nyong'o. That is very important. So, and that's, I think, what is critical. And who are we, of course? So Shelter Afrique is a Pan-African housing institution that operates in over 44 countries in Africa. It's owned by the 44 countries, the African Development Bank, and the Africa Reinsurance Corporation. Our vision is clear: the delivery of decent, affordable green homes to Africans, large-scale, low-cost housing. So our target market are the most vulnerable, and we believe that with climate change, they are the most affected. We've looked through our Center of Excellence, which has told us that 35% of the energy consumption in 2019 actually came from buildings, whilst 38% of all carbon emissions actually came from building and construction materials. So we have no option but to adapt to climate change. There is another research that was taken by the African Development Bank, which tells us that by 2050, there's actually going to be a 15% reduction in the gross domestic product in Africa because of our failure to adapt to climate changes. So Shelter Afrique has a clear strategy, a deliberate plan by partnering with the International Finance Corporation, IFC, to actually deliver housing projects that are green compliant. These are EDGE compliant. EDGE means excellence in design for greater efficiency. Now, we as Shelter Afrique, of course, believe that we can make a difference because at the end of the day, we influence the financing of low-cost housing, and we encourage our clients, the developers, the contractors in their design to ensure that it is green compliant. It actually will be able to deliver efficiencies in terms of in the consumption of the normal utilities, whether it's energy, electricity, water, and the like. Why EDGE? Is because it is a green building standard that is actually certified and utilized in over 150 countries. It does empower building professionals to efficiently determine the most cost-effective ways to build green based on occupant behavior, building type, and local climate. So, to put things in perspective, we as Shelter Afrique have recognized that our target market, the more vulnerable, or the most impacted through climate change, need for us to take the first step by influencing the building designs so that those are green compliant, so that we can actually reduce the carbon footprint in Africa, so that we can also reduce the consumption of energy across the African continent. Of course, this we can only do in collaboration with our stakeholders, our developers, our contractors, and of course, our strategic partner, the International Finance Corporation, with the collaboration of UN Habitat. I thank you for this opportunity, and I believe that if we work together, we will be able to deliver and we will be able to adapt to a rapidly changing climate environment. I thank you for this opportunity. Shukran. Au revoir. Goodbye. Tatenda.
Thank you. Thank you very much for Andrew Chimphondah with this message, also emphasizing the mission of Shelter Afrique in promoting green, compliant, affordable housing, which is part of the financing dilemma that we are facing currently. So now we are approaching the end of this roundtable, but I would like now to turn the floor to each of the participants and give them 1 more minute to either reflect on what they have heard from others or to state a message about what would be their key message on accelerating climate action that needs to be heard at COP26 in Glasgow. And all this will then form part of the proceedings of this World Cities Day 2021 proceedings. So I'll start with David, who started us off today, about what's his final message or his final words. David.
It's been a real pleasure to hear everyone's insights and the way in which they sort of stimulated different ideas and different related thoughts. I think a couple of things that have stood out to me that I feel are messages we need to take forward to the global policy domains. Firstly, that we cannot separate good urban development from effective climate change responses, both mitigation and adaptation. We can't have effective mitigation and adaptation in cities without good urban development. And good urban development is a precondition. It's not everything, but it's a solid precondition for climate responses, both to reduce emissions and to reduce risk. I think a second thing which has struck me from Sheela, but also from other places, is that the only way of achieving this is through effective working relationships between organized groups of urban residents and local, municipal and national government. That it's the recognition that cities are made by the people who live in them, as well as by the formal bodies which are charged with managing them. And by putting those two things together, it's going to be the most effective, the only effective way to transform cities. So the message then, I suppose, to the delegations, to the parties at the of the Framework Convention, is to recognize the way in which positive urban change takes place, and to recognize that that positive urban change needs to work for all residents, and that there's such a variety of things which cause people to be more vulnerable or that can help them to be more resilient. So a message that focuses both on individuals, but also focuses on the collective processes of change within urban areas.
Thank you very much, David, for those key messages, which I think are very clear and well understood. So let's move now to Monica for her final contribution.
Thanks a lot. Maybe starting with, we have been working a couple of years ago also together with Sheela and UN Habitat in a large network on the building of the resilience of the urban poor. And we identified together like 140 hotspots of cities that are impacted by massive climate change and which are dominated by urban poor. And what we learned from that, let's say we need now to go into the action, and that's, I think, what also Andrew and Sheela was stressing strongly. We have been identifying, we often still miss some data on what are the really sort of the variation of vulnerabilities, the variation of deprivations on city level that gives us a very detailed and specific picture on the local conditions. But we really need to go into the action, and the action means in sort of the action with local communities. And I think that's a strong call to the whole global community that we have to go to the local level and develop actions together with local groups. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's now move to Professor Nyong'o for his closing thoughts.
I am terrified by floods, basically, as a person. Floods in the rural areas, floods in the urban areas, they just cause havoc. You lose property, you lose lives. And yet, if we were to be told, like we were told during COVID, that if floods come, the next day so many people would die, I think we'll do something about it very fast. And I think that the answer lies in how we use the urban space. The reasonable balance between the built-up space in urban areas and the green areas in the urban areas. And also how we build infrastructure in the urban space, whether we provide enough drainage, sewage, and whether the roads are wide enough to be used, whether it is dry or there is rain. So proper planning of the urban space, whether big urban areas, small urban areas, proper use of that urban space, in fact, a good balance between the concrete and the greenery. Proper planning of how many people live there and not discriminating against the what is called high density settlements. You know, that's how you go to City Hall and you are told that is a high density settlement. This is a low density settlement and so on. And yet when it floods, high density settlements really suffer. So we need to kind of decolonize our minds because these words high density come with us for a long time and really democratize the use of urban space and the balance of that use of urban space so that it cannot be vulnerable to flooding. I think that's the opposite of resilience. Resilience means that come rain or sunshine, we shall all enjoy the urban space. Nobody will be left behind, suffering in a high density space when it rains.
Thank you very much, Professor, for those very clear messages related to the threat of flooding, which will become more and more prevalent. I would like now to move to Mr. Rinaldi first, and then give the final word to Honorable Marta Delgado. Alessandro Rinaldi, please.
Yes, well, just a very quick reaction. I think that the one of the points that come out of this discussion is the need for a directionality of the policy effort. So climate change is not detached from COVID recovery, from any other grand, I would say, objective of policy effort, and it has to be streamlined and aligned. I think if only one tile of the puzzle doesn't do their job, then we might risk of having suboptimal impacts on the people, and this is probably one key issue that we have to tackle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your final message. So now, before closing, we would like to give the floor to Honorable Marta Delgado for her final thoughts and closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I think that all has been said. I just want to reflect on two things. Right now, I am reading the declaration of the G20. They have finished the meeting, and they are to support, for example, the fund, the Green Fund, and to gather $100 billion for the fund. In the first place, it is going to be very important to think where that money is going to be invested. And maybe for Glasgow, it's going to be very important to ask for a percentage to be invested at a local level. So this is a first activity that we can support as UN Habitat there in Glasgow. Afterwards, also the fact that we have to reflect on the fact that right now we want to gain resilience and adaptation for cities and to reduce the GHG emissions. But at the same time, the communities are eager to be developed and are demanding more energy, more services, and people is increasing at the city level. So majors and local authorities are going to face both demands at the same time. They are right now, but in the future where technology is going to be in place and where all the people are willing to have access to services, computers, and energy, we need to really switch and make a transition for these energy demand and services that are greener and cleaner. Finally, I have to say that around the world, the power pass from one government to another at the local level is always critical because sometimes, for example, in my country, it's a 3-year period, a non-re-election. Sometimes it can be re-elected, but we have to also support authorities and professionals at the local level to hand over the all the work and also to be permanent or professional service at the local level in government. It will be very important for the future of these goals to have this personnel committed and to keep this personnel of administrative local government inside and take advantage of their abilities and their experience. These are reflections not for the panelists, but that I gather amongst all the ideas that were presented here. And I thank you very much for this opportunity, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Honorable Marta Delgado. And I think all your message and all the messages are well noted. And our executive director is going to lead from tomorrow a mission to London and Glasgow. And I'm sure this message will be used in her speeches and in her engagement with member states. So thank you very much. I'd like to close with asking a round of applause for our very excellent panel, both here and online, I think, who contributed excellently to these very complex questions of urban vulnerability, linking national and local action, as well as financing adaptation. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.